Welcome at the German Council on Foreign Relations. My name is Thomas Kleine-Brockhoff, director here in the building. This evening, we want to talk about the rising costs of extreme weather events and how environmental shocks can become financial shocks and impact the economy. Now, insurance, ladies and gentlemen, is I would say, civilizational accomplishment. It is one of our most important risk-sharing tools. And today, however, its foundations are being tested as climate risks escalate beyond what the system was designed for. So insurance, of course, are quite sensitive to this type of development. Climate-induced damages as they bear the costs of increasing natural disasters. You all know the most recent or most immediate examples of this: California wildfires, State Farm Insurance, one of the largest in the state of California and the whole United States, had a multi-billion-dollar bill to foot. It led to emergency rate hikes, political upheaval. You could call this a wildfire insurance crisis. In this country, we of course know this from the Ahrtal flood. The insurance bill was the cost was about 30 billion euro, only portion of which was finally covered in the end. So in short, there is a need to discuss the economic consequences of climate change, where there is a need for public-private, please come in, join us for public-private collaboration on all of this. And there is always a need, but especially in this case, for smart policy, smart, inventive new policy. So I'm very pleased to welcome Professor Johann Rockström, director of the Potsdam Institute for Climate Impact Research, to this group, who will honor us with a keynote tonight. I'm following the keynote. We will have a panel conversation led by Coco Warner, an old friend and collaborator, director of the Penn International Climate Observatory, which is at Penn World House, which in turn is located at the University of Pennsylvania. And she will also introduce the guests in this group. And before I turn it over to Professor Rockström, let me add a shout out to our events team. This is a long day. We've had a doubleheader with the president in this room. We've had a long year with 200 plus events. We owe them, for after this long year, a debt of gratitude for this and all other events. So thank you, events team.
Good evening, everyone. And this is an opportunity to give you a scientific update, not least after COP30 in Belém. I would argue, based on the evidence that I'll be sharing with you, that we have a wider than ever mismatch between the risk assessment that science is today really overwhelmingly proven with evidence and what this poses in terms of social and economic potential impacts versus the level of political will to act on this challenge. At COP30 in Belém, we put out a science statement showing that the global emission of greenhouse gases must now be reduced at least by 5% globally per year, starting 1st of January 2026, to have any chance of minimizing overshoot, which I'll come back to manageable levels for social and global economy. But the best offer that is on the table, based on the political will in the global economy to act, is to indeed reduce emissions by 5% over 10 years. So we are a factor 10, a multiplier of 10 behind any ability to avoid what I would call not only dangerous climate change, but potentially unmanageable climate change. And what I will now argue is, moreover, that we are underestimating the risk landscape because things are changing very fast. I often start my talks like this, reminding everyone that we are the dominating force of change on planet Earth. The scale and the speed of impact is today a geological force of change. This is based, as you know, on the hockey stick patterns of pressures on the planet and the response of the planet across all domains that determines the resilience of the whole climate system. Unfortunately, we can today conclude we are no longer in the Anthropocene. We're deep into the Anthropocene. We're now following a pathway. This is a paper that has just come out on the State of the Climate System 2025, where we are heading, as you know, to a 3.1 degrees Celsius global mean surface temperature on planet Earth within the next 75 years. This is a point we haven't seen on planet Earth over the past 3 million years. What you see on this graph is just the last 20,000 years, which is since we left the last ice age, which is the extraordinarily stable environmental conditions that has been the basis for the global economy for the past 12,000 years, when we shifted from hunters and gatherers to sedentary communities and developed the civilizations as we know it. So we can today, from an Earth system science perspective, say that this is the planet that the global economy depends on, and now we're deviating away from it so far that I would argue that even if I'll be showing you some references of climate econometric assessment that can give quantitative numbers of what can appear to be manageable impacts on the global economy, there is no scientific evidence. I really want to emphasize this. There is no scientific evidence that we can take responsibility for the world as we know it when we exceed even beyond 2 degrees Celsius of warming. Because already at 2 degrees Celsius, we're outside of the entire corridor of life over the past quaternary, meaning the last 3 million years. At 3 degrees Celsius, we have to wind back the clock 4 million years. For those of you who remember in school, we've been around as modern humans for the last 250,000 years. So we're talking about fundamental changes that have no evidence whatsoever of being able to support even the basic dignity and life support for humans. So that is the starting point. And added to that comes the drama, the concern, which is that from the observations we have to the left-hand side on observations on temperature in the atmosphere, and to the right, the sea surface temperatures from the over 3,000 Argo floats across the ocean, we're starting, unfortunately, to see for the first time an accelerated rate of warming, both in the ocean and in the atmosphere. Now, we cannot fully explain this yet, but we do, unfortunately, have to conclude the following. It's not only forcing, meaning it's not only us loading more greenhouse gases or getting rid of air pollutants, it must also be a combination of feedbacks. And feedbacks means that the planet is starting to change its functions. It's about cloud dynamics, it's about albedo, the color of the planet, and it's also about carbon uptake capacities in the land, meaning ecosystems that are showing the first signs of decline. This is serious because if the planet is showing a weakness to buffer the anthropogenic impacts we are causing in the global economy, that means that the climate sensitivity is higher than we had expected. This means that the carbon budget is reduced. This means that the cost of carbon is higher. This means that the impact on the global economy is even worse than we had expected. This is something we have to take into consideration because this is, I would argue, the most important scientific evidence we brought to COP13 Belém to try and guide the climate policies, which we, by the way, largely failed with. These are the AR6 scenarios, but they've been updated with a whole series of new scenarios, not only by us here at the Potsdam Institute, but other colleagues around the world. They show, to begin with, that unfortunately we've loaded so much heat into the system. The energy imbalance is at such a high level that we can no longer follow the blue lines, which are the scenarios that essentially do not exceed 1.5 degrees Celsius. The best science can offer are the magenta lines here, which is one, we will very likely breach the 1.5 limit within the next 5 to 10 years. Secondly, to limit warming to a peak of roughly what you see here, 1.7 degrees Celsius, requires an accelerated phase out of fossil fuels, scaling of carbon dioxide removal, transformation of the global food system, and ensuring that we do not cross any tipping points on land or in the ocean. It's a global sustainability transformation to then be able to come back within 75 years to under the 1.5 degrees Celsius limit that we signed on in the Paris Agreement. What we know for certain with this journey, even if we were to succeed, is the following. It's exactly what Thomas pointed out earlier here. It is extreme events. The Los Angeles fires, but also the Valencia floods. These events will almost with certainty increase fires, drought, heat waves, human reinforced storms, labor productivity reduced, even life-threatening wet bulb temperatures. We know that these impacts cost, just in 2024, the global economy more than $200 billion. The point about insurance industry, I hope we can come back to that, is what is now starting to come at premium levels that can no longer be supported because of the risks of causing such large damage. So that is where we are. But in addition to this, if we breach 1.5, we enter a domain of risks of crossing tipping points. So not only do extreme events increase in frequency and impact on the economy, we risk also causing irreversible changes to the functioning of the entire Earth system. I'm sure you know we have several of these tipping points. These are the latest mapping. I just show the planet here so that you see they are spread across the entire planet. 6 of them up in the Arctic. You have the AMOC regulating the ocean, heat exchange in the North Atlantic, the Amazon rainforest, 3 in Antarctica, the tropical coral reef systems. These are what we today understand being the big tipping point systems that regulate the stability of the climate system, keep them on the right side of the fence, and they help us. They cool the planet. Push them too far by winding up the temperature and degrading ecosystems, transgressing planetary boundaries, and they are at risk of irreversibly crossing a threshold, and they drift off and get stuck in a state that will very likely emit more carbon, meaning amplifying warming, but also undermining the economy, undermining productivity levels and opportunities for economic development. This is what we had to put up at COP30 in Belém. It was actually one of the most painful science statements that we put out. We did 4 of them, by the way. For the first time, we hosted a planetary science pavilion. To the left-hand side, we have the Amazon basin. To the right-hand side, you have a tropical coral reef system. These are planet Earth's richest biomes on land and in the ocean. These are massive assets. They have invaluable economic value. They regulate fresh water. The Amazon basin is a store of over 100 petagrams of carbon. That's equivalent to almost 10 years of global emissions. The tropical coral reef systems is livelihoods for over 400 million people. I mean, these are big systems for social and economic development. We put the risk of crossing these tipping points at 1.5. It's admittedly a range of uncertainty, but that's where the median lands. And what you see here is from the Planetary Science Pavilion. What you see here is Professor Carlos Nobre, who is, I would argue, the authority in the world on Amazon tipping point science, where we're trying to inform the economy or the policy gathered at COP30 that these are unacceptable risks. That's at least my assessment. That's our assessment. But this did not carry home in the policy debate. We did not get a connectivity between the economic risks this is and the science that we produced. The journey, which I just summarized to you, is here on the graph. We have quantifications on this. The rate of reduction of greenhouse gases is at least 5% reductions per year. The transformation of the global food system from source to sink, scaling of CDR, and you see in green and blue, maintaining the carbon sinks on land and in the ocean, what I call the largest subsidy to the global economy. 50% of the carbon dioxide from the fossil fuel burning that drives the global economy is not in the atmosphere. It's sucked up and buffered in a healthy planet. But that planet is starting to show cracks in that ability. This is why we need a planetary boundary framework to guide the economy. And let me just put as a little bracket, I'm so proud, actually, that the World Economic Forum in January 2026 will have prosperity within planetary boundaries as one of their official themes for the Global Economic Annual Meeting. So we're getting at least somewhere with a few communities around the world, but this is where we are. 9 large environmental processes that guides the stability of the Earth system, and therefore I would argue guides the direction of the global economy. But the costs are high, and you've seen it with the World Economic Forum. We put out a study quite recently showing that you are at risk of a 12% decline in global GDP for every 1 degree Celsius of warming. This was then plugged into this planetary solvency study, which is very linked to also insurance and risk assessments, showing that we are no longer facing just single number risks in terms of income decline because of global warming trajectories we're following, but we're talking big numbers. I mean, by the end of this century, potentially even a 50% decline of GDP. These are associated with huge uncertainties, but it's just important to remind ourselves that most studies, I mean, that this is the classic work by Marshall, Bark et al., showing the optimal productivity levels at a stable 14 degrees Celsius temperature level. But if we move towards the 2 to 3 degrees Celsius of warming, we are at risk of having a 20 to 25% decline of GDP. And these are only based on labor productivity decline. These are not tipping points. These are not even precipitation extremes. This is just wind up the temperature. What does it impact on labor productivity in economies around the world? All these climate econometric analysis show also what you see on the map here, which is really disturbing, not least from a foreign policy perspective, that the red countries in the world are the big losers. Here you have generally more than 25% reductions in GDP, while on the short term at least, these studies show that the economies can actually benefit in the colder northern hemisphere economies in the world. That is in itself a huge paradox because it's the northern hemisphere OECD economies that predominantly have caused the warming in the first place. I'd like to point you to this work, which is from Howard and Thomas Sterner. Thomas Sterner, a colleague, not least from Sweden, showing that already at 2 degrees Celsius warming, we have, if you do a broad meta-analysis of econometrics, a range between 5 and 10% decline of GDP, depending on whether you include risks of irreversible changes or not. And just to close this, to also say that the economy, and I hope we come back to this, it's not only about, assessing the costs of inaction. What are the benefits of action? Where is the future for humanity? And I think it's clear today that we have 3 large transformations that have to occur very fast to have any chance of following the pathway I summarized earlier. Of course, the energy transition, the food system transition, and halting the loss of nature. When it comes to food, we recently published the Lancet Commission report, where we asked the question, can we feed 10 billion people within planetary boundaries with healthy food? The health scientists show very clearly that to have the best health outcomes, we want to transition away from the overconsumption of animal proteins and have a more balanced flexitarian diet with 50% plant-based sourcing of proteins, not necessarily shifting away from animal protein entirely, but reducing it to very balanced levels. We can come back to that if you're interested. We also looked at the quantifications of what would it be required for the entire value chain of the food system to stay within the sustainability criteria of planetary boundaries. Here you have the 9 planetary boundaries. You see again the transgression levels of the 7 boundaries that are outside of the safe space, which, by the way, I would argue strongly argues why we're starting to see accelerated rates of warming. It's not so surprising when biodiversity, overuse of fresh water, land use change, and overloading of nitrogen and phosphorus are so far outside of anything we've seen over the past 12,000 years. But look at this. Here is our assessment of the food system's responsibility. Isn't that quite something? The food system is the single largest cause for breaching the boundaries. It's a third of greenhouse gases, #1 biodiversity loss, by far the largest consumer of fresh water, a massive loader of pesticides and antibiotics, by far the number one eutrophier of dead zones and coastal zones because of overuse of nitrogen and phosphorus. To put it simple, fix the food system, and we are on a quite good pathway in the right direction. We've done scenario modeling on this. Is this possible to feed humanity within safe operating space of planetary boundaries? This is where we would be heading on the planetary boundaries if we continue consuming and producing food as today. We'll just go deeper and deeper into the red. If we, on the other hand, transition to healthy diets, we would, just by that step, come back into the boundaries on climate and land, but not succeed on nitrogen, phosphorus, and fresh water. But if we combine it with an energy transition and really decarbonize, particularly fertilizer industry in the world, we would essentially come back into the safe operating space for the food system. This is quite exciting. A food system transformation seems to be possible, and it would have massive social and economic benefits for people, particularly in terms of health costs. We've, with the World Economic Forum, again, mapped technologies to bring this back into safe space and showing that this is not a utopia. It's not fantasy to scale technologies across essentially all sectors to start bringing us back within a safe space. The energy transition, moreover, has so much evidence today of being on an S curve of adoption of renewable energy technologies. I show this graph because we generally underestimate the fact that also the global south is actually following exponential curves on adoption of solar and wind. On electric mobility, we have all the evidence, not least today increasing in Asia, but here you have the tipping point in Norway to the right. 90% of vehicles in Norway are today electric. Denmark is on its way on this journey. It's quite interesting to see that these are tipping points that are driven by economic policies. To a large extent, it starts with subsidies, but then they kind of take off on their own. And finally, just to close this, we also clearly conclude that we need to be stewards of the biomes to secure the carbon sinks in all what we call the global commons today, which cannot no longer just be the systems outside of national jurisdictions. They have to be the tipping point systems, the Amazon rainforest, the Greenland ice sheet, the large AMOC system, and that these have to get an economic value to be able to be also part of a stewardship system where we no longer see these systems as just being exotics far away somewhere on the other side of the planet, but that they are assets that actually determine even jobs and economic development in Germany, the stability of these systems, because otherwise they'll send invoices back to us and amplify warming and make things even more difficult, irrespective of where you live on planet Earth. So the econometrics has a new scale to it. And we have been now starting to update the state of the planet much more frequently. This is the 2025 update of all the planetary boundaries. We place the planet outside of the safe space, but not yet in this red zone, which actually suggests that there's still a window to turn this around, but it requires massive global economic policy measures to accelerate the rate of phasing out fossil fuels and halting the loss of the biosphere, which are fundamental, therefore, for the economy. And with that, looking forward to the discussion together. Thank you.
That's lovely. Well, that was a really compelling keynote. Thank you so much, Professor Rockström. I'll just add my thanks to the German Council on Foreign Relations for hosting this really interesting, important, timely conversation this evening. Everyone, my name is Coco Warner. Thanks again, Thomas, for the kind introduction. And I'd like to introduce people who really almost don't need an introduction. All of you are in the room because of our incredible panel and the amazing work anyway that the German Council on Foreign Relations does. But let me quickly at least tell you who we're about to hear from, following up on the impulse that you've given us, Johan. To my immediate left, we're joined by Dr. Gunther Thallinger, who's a member of the board of management of Allianz. Allianz is one of the leading insurers, as you know, and we're talking about risk, but we're also talking about, in financial terms, there are downsides and upsides of risk. And I think from the private sector perspective, we're just really keen to hear what the situation looks like from your perspective. Next, we're joined by Dr. Kira Vinke, who is here at the German Council on Foreign Relations. Some of you know Kira's research. She's also head of the Center here for Climate and Foreign Policy. So thank you for welcoming us to your professional home. And then, of course, Professor Rockström. As all of you know, Professor Rockström is director of the Potsdam Institute for Climate Impact Research. So what we'd like to do in this conversation for about the next hour before we turn to you as our audience is would like to have 3 short conversations. And obviously I prepared myself with some questions, but what we really want is to hear your perspectives. That's why all of us are here. And also would really welcome you if you want to have a conversation with yourselves. I'm just here to help and keep time, but it's really about understanding some of the tensions and possibilities. The science shows us where we need to go. The economics tell us what's feasible, and feasible in a really good way. There's some great possibilities. And of course, the politics shapes the decisions and tells us what is possible in some of these political areas. So we'll have 3 conversations. We'll start off where you ended, Professor Rockström, and that is, where are we right now? What are some of the pocketbook impacts that we may be feeling now or in the future, whether it's interest rates or inflation? Some of us have mortgages. Some of us are earlier in our career than others and wonder what are going to be the labor market impacts. But really, what do we expect climate change to intersect with the real economy? We'll move on to resilience, and in this case, financial resilience. How can society buffer some of these impacts that you were talking about? And then we'll end with a look to the future. This has been quite a year, and more is coming. For all of you who are looking ahead to 2026, we're going to go into that space and probably a little bit beyond and look at what would it take to align global financial flows with our ambitions to have a healthy planet, to have thriving society, to have a world of cooperation and collaboration in the political space. And then we'll turn to you. So let's get started. If I can start with you, Johan, since you gave this wonderful presentation, what can you tell us about the current effects on some of these real economic issues, whether it's inflation, jobs, interest rates? And what do you see as some of the underestimated risks that we need to be thinking about?
Yeah, thanks. So, well, to start with, I think one should just recognize how challenging it is to get a global mapping on the economic impacts of climate change. So far, we are, as I mentioned, able to do it quite, I would say, in a quite elaborate way with regards to labor productivity and heat. So basically, health threatening and productivity threatening heat levels. We're also able to map, not least through the insurance companies around the world, when it comes to quantifying the costs of extreme events related to precipitation extremes, so droughts, floods, storms in particular. And when you do that, you start seeing uncomfortably high numbers now starting to come out. We're not yet at the $1 trillion level, but certainly at the hundreds of billion US dollar costs related to extreme events. Now, there is always a challenge there to also get the attribution associated to these, because we know that climate change, human-caused climate change, is never, occurring in isolation. We're amplifying natural variability, and I think that is one reason why this question is a complex question. But what we're missing so far, and what I would argue being a major challenge, not least scientifically ahead, is that we're not able to yet quantify the economic impacts of crossing tipping points, of having collapse of systems. And these collapse of systems does not necessarily have to be, a fundamental shutdown of the AMOC. It can just be when farmers in Tanzania no longer plant the short rains anymore because they're simply occurring year after year, 3 weeks too late. And these are, of course, social implications that have major economic impacts that are very difficult to quantify, but they're very fundamental. So I think we still, at large, are underestimating the economic costs of climate impacts, even today, because we are so far basically only able to get a subset of extreme events and not really look at the fundamental changes caused by climate change.
Great, thank you so much. And Gunther, if I could turn to you, Johan was just mentioning a couple of areas that you know a lot about. We've seen on the evening news in the last years, fires, floods, all kinds of the extreme events that we heard in your keynote. Can you tell us what you're seeing either in your modeling or data from that insurance perspective? What are we seeing in terms of some of these costs?
Well, I would say the costs were mentioned already in the introductory speech. We had heard about the Ahrtal, the 30 billion as one example. It's only one event. And it's true we could go now into many, many examples and many quantifications. I think a perspective that one can take on this is the risk is increasing because we have heard the energy level in the atmosphere is going up. With the energy level in the atmosphere going up, there are simply certain events that are just more intense, if I may say it that way. This means the risk goes up. Question is therefore, can we afford to take the risk? That is an interesting question, I would say. And in many examples, we do see we may not be able to afford it because the intermediary, which is the insurer or another financial market participant, just walks away. They don't insure. They do not participate in this market. So this is a good example for at least a signal we cannot afford it. And I would say there we should start. Can we afford the risk? And on that, I may give let's say, an example from steering a company. It's quite common that the management of a company would say, if there is a risk that is existential, so we go bust as a company, then usually the management does not start to calculate the likelihood of that risk. The management simply says, this has to be avoided. Why is that? Because the owner of a company would never say, yeah, of course, you management, go ahead, and perhaps you risk the existence of my company. No, you would always say, this risk has to be avoided. In the presentation that we just have seen, we are going a multitude of risks that are existential. And funnily, as a society, we start to discuss what is the likelihood.
Oh, I'm waiting, but that is remarkable. Thank you. Yeah. What's the second thing that a board would talk about? You see a risk like what you just said. We need to avoid the risk. What would be the next topic on your agenda?
Well, once you have understood that there's a certain risk and then you are, let's say, changing your behavior and you're not taking the risk, well, then let's say the normal business discussion starts. Then you can have, let's say, all kind of things. But the very important thing is that it is quite common for companies that existential risks are not taken. That's the important thing. And the rest is then, yes, I would say normal business steering, many discussions.
Okay, great. Thank you so much. You stopped us in our tracks there. You give us a lot to think about. Kira, Gunther's just talked about some signals to watch. I know that you've had an eye on things like demographics, people, where they live, how they live. In your research, what are some signals that you're watching? are people feeling climate impacts in their own pocketbooks?
Yes, of course, we are seeing the many effects of climate change throughout the globe. Yeah, so I just recently got off the phone with some colleagues from UNHCR, and we were discussing the situation in Sudan and Chad. Yeah, and of course, we are seeing the horrific violence that is occurring in Sudan. But what is also happening is that this country is heavily affected by floods, and this is also displacing people. And this means that we are seeing this joint effects in many areas of crises, of violence, but also climate change, and governments that are not able to confront these changes. And then people are migrating internally, but they're also migrating to neighboring regions. Then you have the situation in Chad, receiving many refugees. And where are they living? They're living in refugee camps that are extremely hot, yeah, that are extremely underfinanced also. And these situations are aggravating. This is one example from a crisis zone, yeah. But of course, you have just mentioned the Ahrtal. We are not isolated from these effects. Even in very advanced societies, in very industrialized countries, in a state like California, yeah, very strong economy, most developed country, they cannot adapt fully. Already now, we have 1.23 degrees. We are maybe now transgressing the 1.5 degree target, maybe at least temporarily. We are on track to transgress it for a long time. It's exactly what you are saying. We have to avoid the risk. But what we are seeing, I just came back from Belém, from Brazil. What we're seeing in Brazil is that we don't have the consensus to move forward multilaterally. So the question is, how can we move ahead plurilaterally? And then the German government also has to act and take leadership in this situation.
Great. I want to ask you about either this round or next. Are you seeing some early warning indicators that you mentioned governments, it might be business or people in different sectors might be looking out for, just to get a sense of, oh, things are getting risky, things are getting a little unstable?
Yes, of course. I think it's, for example, if you look at the coastlines, we are seeing already insurers, and maybe you can also share some insights on this, insurers moving away from high-risk areas. We are seeing this, for example, in the United States, in Florida. We are seeing it in California. We are seeing that houses are no longer insurable in certain areas, and people are therefore, because of the climate risk of the wildfires, of the tropical cyclones hitting Florida, and we are seeing that the value of houses of which people have mortgages, as you mentioned earlier, is then being downgraded and is putting people into very difficult situations. And of course, much of the world is not insured, yeah? So their properties are not insured. And this is, as Thomas has mentioned at the beginning, it is a civilizational achievement. And the question is, how can we, for the longest time possible, secure these civilizational achievements within the changing climate? Because that is the question. Because often it's said, oh yeah, we can adapt somehow, and people are so innovative. And of course, we have sent people to the universe, yeah, we have sent people out into space. But with what technological and financial capacities allocated? Where are these financial capacities going to come from if we have more and more extreme events? And there will be very difficult questions to be answered in allocating these capacities. Will we invest, for example, in Germany and the northern sea islands? Will we continue to invest regularly, putting sand there to protect the coastal lines? Will we do it frequently? We will do it more often if more and more storms come, if more coastal erosion is coming. How will we balance these questions in the future? Right now, we can still pay for it in many cases in Germany, but as Johan has very explicatively illustrated, this may end in the future.
Wow. So one of my takeaways listening to all three of you is we may, as kind of people from whatever sector, focus in on the thing that is in our day-to-day lives. But pretty soon, whether you're on a board or whether you're at the end of the month paying, or the beginning of the month paying your home mortgage, you start seeing these interlinkages. And what I heard from all three of you is that climate-related risks and impacts are present. They're in our real economy. We're thinking about them. Great. I'd like to go on to our next kind of round. And I hope that you as an audience are thinking about some things that you'd like to dig into a little bit more. Thinking about financial resilience. Kira, you mentioned there's a link between if you're a homeowner and you can't get home insurance, what would your bank say to whom you're paying back your mortgage, or maybe the other way around? I'm from the US, so I know that that's a very close link. If you can't insure your home, it's really hard to get a mortgage. Or if the bank sees, your house is actually at quite high risk, it really affects people. What I'd like us to be thinking about here is financial resilience. And Gunther, maybe I could start with you and hear some of your thoughts. In your world, how do you think about financial risk and pricing? And what could we learn from your perspective that might help us think through how climate impacts may affect, again, pocketbook issues, pricing issues?
Yeah, as an insurer, quite obviously, you kind of try to be quite performing in assessing what the risk is in terms of negative value, and then you come up with a price. That's the insurance premium, quite obviously. Insurers can do this very, very well. You can do this. You just look into the numbers that the insurance sector is reporting. There are quite a number of players. They really are quite profitable. So apparently, they are able to price risk. That's an information game. You need to understand the risk, and that's how you actually do it. Increasing risk actually is something that is, and that may sound almost cynical, but I don't mean it cynically, but this is good for the insurance company because the more risk, the more business, so you can actually do it. However, this may not be affordable for societies. It may simply be not affordable that, let's say, a house is insured against a certain form of flood risk if it is in the delta of a certain river, and flood occurs quite frequently there. So it's just not affordable as such. It could easily be that in very, very extreme cases, the premium is not far away from the total value of the house because you need to expect that the house is gone, let's say, in a certain short period of time. That's not affordable. And as you say, then most certainly many other financial institutions may not be willing to do anything with this house because the house is not insured. The asset may just be gone. Yeah. So why, as a bank, would you finance it via a mortgage if the asset behind the mortgage is simply not there tomorrow? You're not going to finance this because this money that you use for financing is gone. So obviously, this whole risk discussion is a very relevant one for the entire financial, let's say, set of financial markets. You could go also very theoretical into this if you have a logic about efficient capital markets. Without insurance, they cannot be efficient. It's very important. Then you have many very strange things. Pricing doesn't work for many players. You have, let's say, all situations of incomplete markets and these type of things. So if you really like to be into this theoretical discussion, then you can go into this, and this will also send you signals. This is something that you do not want to have. So you really would like to work on this. But as I say, for the financial markets, that's something that they can, for the time being, cope with to a certain degree. Whether society can do it is not so clear. And that is our true problem, because in the end, financial markets are basically nothing with, let's say, societies that use these markets. And that's something that we discussed quite intensively in the insurance industry for quite some while. If I may, one other element in terms of financing, we do have both the technical means and the financing capabilities to transform our economies, at least along the purple curves that we have seen. If we really made an effort, we could actually be lower than the purple curves that we have seen from Johan. We could. So technical means and the financing capability are there. They are there. Very often I get challenged and they say, no, we cannot finance this. This is not possible. No, we can, absolutely. We are talking, let's say, 1-digit percentage figures of GDP. That's what we do. To just give you an example that perhaps you are willing to follow me, you have seen the information about the food system, how impactful it is. We waste 1/3 of the food produced. That's what we do. We waste 1/3. So by just not wasting this 1/3, you reduce the impact by 1/3, don't you? So just stop wasting food. 1/3 down, the impact. It's not so trivial. What do we do with food waste? Yeah, nothing. By the way, you also could use quite some productivity of human workers. Why is that? Because roughly 25% of all human workers are in food production. Now, yeah, I'm a mathematician, so I dare to do a little bit of a calculation. If you do a little bit of a calculation, you do the 25%, and the 1/3 you do this, then all of a sudden you learn it's more than 10% of all people who do work. They do nothing else than producing food waste. And now some people tell me we cannot finance the transformation.
Yeah. What do you say? You hear the percentages, the margins. Thank you very much. I mean, I'm just looking at all of you and the thoughtful expressions that you have on your faces. Can I just actually ask Kira, Johan, you're looking so thoughtful. Do you want to respond to Gunther's thoughts? If not, I do have a question for you, but.
No, but I fully agree with Günther, and I tried to emphasize that in a bit of a flying way, that we have reached a very interesting juncture when it comes to the planetary crisis we're in, because not only do we have overwhelming evidence of unacceptable risk, but we also have overwhelming evidence of scalable solutions, that moreover, that once you're crossing that investment gauntlet that admittedly is there, you come out as a winner in the other end, both in terms of resilience, health, security, but also very likely jobs and economy, and certainly more technologically advanced societies. So it's quite remarkable that we're still stuck, given that you have both of these pieces of evidence coming forward so significantly. And when you do the math around this, it comes across as quite shocking. I mean, not only is the food system associated with 30% food waste, but it actually leads from 3 different independent studies to 15 million people prematurely dying each year unnecessarily because of unhealthy food. All forms of malnutrition, all forms of non-communicable diseases. And these are numbers that actually exceed the number of premature deaths during the COVID pandemic. So during the COVID pandemic, we stepped up as a collective to address a planetary crisis. And we can debate a lot of whether we did that in the right way, but at least we listened to authorities, we listened to science, and we stepped up, and we solved it, at least temporarily. And nothing hinders us to do the same at this point. I totally agree with Günther there that it's a myth that this is not a solvable problem. It actually is, and we've done some mapping across the so-called famous difficult to abate sectors. And they actually don't really qualify as difficult to abate anymore. We have solutions for cement, for fertilizer, for steel, for aluminium. I mean, heavy trucks. You can even fly airplanes without necessarily using fossil fuels. The problem is that we are sending the wrong economic signals, that we are subsidizing the fossil fuel-based driven economy, not only explicitly with $4 to $5 trillion per year, I mean, in real cash, but also the biggest one is that the planet is subsidizing. You're not paying for the damage.
Okay, so I'm hearing actually, Kira, you wanted to hop in. Why don't you go ahead?
Yeah, I just want to jump in on the issue of this question of why are we navigating ourselves into overshoot? And you just illustrated the absurdity of the sort of gridlock that we're in. with the emissions not yet really sinking. And as we are maneuvering into this overshoot, and I attended a conference on investigating what this overshoot means on many dimensions. And as we're navigating ourselves into this, we have to be aware that what you saw in this curve is that the coming up is not the same as the coming down. No? And there will be economic winners and losers of this process. And we have to be very aware of this, that if we drive the temperature up, first of all, I would argue it's not entirely clear if we can drive it down again societally, if there will be enough societal consensus to then drive it down to the sort of Paris corridor or lower to the lower threshold. Because of course, there will be those who are benefiting somehow and those who are victims of this, small island states, etc. So I do think that what is driving this overshoot is this argument that we cannot go quickly enough, we cannot change overnight. And as somebody who has also attended now 10 international climate negotiations, this argument has occurred since the first one I attended, and probably many more. And it is, I think what Günther has now pointed out is this frustration also of the resistance to change. And often the argument is used that we need this emissions for development, but what is happening is that a lot of emissions go towards convenience, no? Or they go towards luxury emissions, I would say. And I think there we need to at least find a pricing instrument so that this sort of CO2 overconsumption is somehow priced, so that you have some money available that you can then reinvest in, for example, green technologies. And we should also do this here in Europe because China has seen that the economic future lies within the green technologies and energy efficiency technologies and is heavily investing. And if we want to play a role in the future global market with our technologies, we need to invest much more than we are right now.
And would any of you like to comment on, I don't know, some of the parts of financial resilience that might be, you're mentioning in a way, the really rapidly lowering costs of renewable energies vis-a-vis legacy fuels?
Yeah, I'm more than happy to comment on this one. China is a super example. Indeed, one can, by the way, also mention Texas. Texas is also a super example. It's one of the states in the US, the state in the US that really builds out renewable energy. Very important because usually people have some doubts about the US, but it's not the case. Texas, good example, a good example here. But in terms of, let's say, the financial resilience, we should really think that renewable energy is by now, of course, the cheapest form of energy that we can provide. We are talking something like, I don't know, 3 to 7 to 8 cents per kilowatt hour. That's what we have in the form of electricity. Let's say the overall efficiency of this is also enormously high compared to all the other sources of energy. So we start with this. The important thing is it's not only the cheapest, it's also in terms of building capacity the fastest. Here in Germany, we like to talk about gas power plants. This is if you are super fast with a gas power plant, let's say you do this in 3 years. Well, then you are really very fast. The same capacity with solar power is rather a quarter of a year. You do it slowly, half a year, no problem. But half a year is perhaps less than 3 years. Why is that speed so important? Yeah, well, because we have, of course, an increasing, let's say, need for energy, especially electricity. And here is perhaps another good example why we need to actually think about this financial stability, resilience that you mentioned, and let's say this form of speed. Machine support, neural networks, language models, whatever you want to think of, needs electricity. And we need to build out the capacity for this machine support. Whether we like it or not, others do. We also need to do this. We, meaning all other economies. If you think that a data center, the big ones are 5 gigawatts, very big. I admit 5. You are going to take the energy for this data center with gas power plants. You are just 3 years behind competition. And that is something that you would like to do with language models, with neural network training. There's no way that you ever succeed. Just think of where we were with neural networks 3 years ago. This is where you would be thinking of if you think that electricity should come not from renewable energy. What I would like to highlight with this example is that actually economic competitiveness and sustainable form of energy markets go hand in hand. If you insist on non-renewable energy, you insist on being not competitive. That's what you do. It's very strange. It's very strange that we even have this discussion. It's very strange. Who wants to be not competitive in 2, 3, 4 years' time? Who is that? I have another example regarding financial, let's say, resilience. We discuss so much about bureaucracy, don't we? We just, these days, I think 24 hours ago, we heard about what happened in the omnibus, let's say, process, CSRD, ESRS. These are the acronyms that, let's say, come with this. In the name of reducing bureaucracy, we figured out we don't need transition plans anymore. I could now come up with many examples, like financial players, how should they deal without this information? Is one example, but I don't want to go for that. Obviously, they can't deal without the information, they need it. But more importantly is we talk about this bureaucracy. Who talks about the bureaucracy that we introduced in Germany with the Erneuerbare Energiengesetz version 2017? The Vergabeverfahren, let's say, the auctioning of subsidies and these type of things. This wonderful revision of the Erneuerbare Energiengesetz in Germany led to 2017, 5 gigawatts of wind power. 2018, a little bit more than 1. It's a fifth. And the reason was not that the people in Germany all of a sudden learned, no, wind power is not something that we should do. No, they just had this bureaucracy that hindered it. So the interesting thing is that we need to have the connection of these discussions. Sustainability and economy go hand in hand, really hand in all aspects. This is very important that we take this. We can finance it. We can do it technologically. We could do the political decision-making to actually address it. And then as a result, we would have a different financial stability, yes.
That sounds pretty good. What I also find really interesting is often we think about how much money. You've also made us aware of it's how we do our laws, how we foster business, how we foster competitiveness. It's more than just the money. Johann, if I could ask you, and just a note for the audience, our conversation has flown by and we're almost to you, so get ready because we're coming to you in just a minute. But Johann, could I ask you, you know the Paris Agreements, you mentioned Article 2, which is kind of the objective of that legal instrument. Do you have any thoughts about what it would take to kind of enliven this vision or this reality that you just told us about? What would it take to align global flows with a resilient future? Also a financially resilient future, a stable one.
Yeah, well, actually, it's 2 years now since I wrote a letter to Simon Steele, the head of UNFCCC, suggesting a reform of the whole COP process. And the first paragraph in that letter says, "Dear Simon, I think we should start by sending out a public statement to the world that we should celebrate. We don't need to negotiate anymore. Everything is set. We have now had 30 years, essentially, of negotiations, and all the components of the legally binding Paris Agreement is in place. It's not perfect. I would definitely like to see improvements, but now we need to turn page and start the implementation phase. And that is actually what the COP presidency tried to do in Belém, inviting the world to the COP of truth and implementation to try and get roadmaps to accelerate the phase out of fossil fuels and the roadmap to halt deforestation. And those roadmaps has all to do with financial resilience. It's all about de-risking, decommissioning of coal-fired plants in the global south. It's really about putting investments behind that hump that we need to go across. Because I totally agree with you, Günther, that there is absolutely no economic argument to produce electricity from fossil fuels essentially anywhere in the world today. But still we're stuck in many economies. And the reason for this, of course, is that many of these fossil fuel driven electricity producing infrastructure are state-owned, and they are exploiting resources at zero cost because they're basically public sector assets. And this means that the whole system is simply a manipulated, economically violating every principle that anyone would agree in economics. And I think that is what the COP process should focus on, is to get these concrete plans in place of how to de-risk investments, of how to start decommissioning fossil fuel-based electricity to start with, and then also getting the financial flows to align with the real costs and real benefits. And of course, a global price on carbon would be one very important tool in that journey. Now, many people still talk of that as a utopia, but the reality is that over 40 countries in the world are operating a price on carbon. And with the CBAM coming along in the European Union, the Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism, this is very likely going to spill over into also having kind of an organic growth of a price on carbon in different economies around the world, India, for example. So I think we should not give up on the ability of correcting the economic mistakes that can also accelerate the pathway to implement. But then the COP process must stop negotiating and creating, paper-based commitments that nobody delivers on, and to start becoming an accountability measure for reporting on progress and really exploring the ways to accelerate that transition.
Yeah, thank you. And Kira, for this part of the conversation, before we go over to the audience, in your work, I've heard you talk a lot about people. And you have spent also a lot of time thinking about distributional impacts. You mentioned it. That really stuck with me a few minutes ago. How do we deal with these winners and losers? How do we think about budgets?
Thanks. Yeah, a very good point, because of course we know that those who are in positions of deprivation, they will suffer the most from the impacts of climate change. Now, this is a well-known thing. Those who don't have access to insurance, who cannot afford an insurance, who, when they lose one harvest, they are already at the brink of facing hunger, etc., that those will be affected by these very tremendous changes. And so the questions are how to actually basically supply more funding so that people can adapt to a degree to the changes that are happening already, and also where we can help people to leapfrog the development of fossil fuel-based economies. Yeah, so I think there we need to have much more efforts in, for example, the just energy transition partnerships. I think this was, in many cases, a way forward, and to replicate this and to find more partners to engage in this, I think will be crucial. And I have a lot of hope also about the roadmap initiative that the Brazilians put forward, and that is now being taken forward by the Colombian and Netherlands government to discuss also next year how to transition away from fossil fuels, to make more concrete announcement in this direction. I think this is something that we should also support in different areas through funding, governmental funding, but also through capacity building engagement of different groups. If I may, I would like to comment on one issue of the renewable energy competitiveness and the upscaling of this, and the financial resilience of our systems, because this is not only an economic question. Of course, there are financial risks that are tied to the geopolitical risks that are now inflamed. Yeah. So, and this inflammation, so to say, is also fueled by the fossil fuel-based economy. And the question I think we have to ask ourselves in Europe is, how many autocracies do we want to fund through our fossil fuel imports? Yeah. We are importing more than 90% of our oil, almost 90% of our gas. And this is money. Of course, some of this also is going to democracies, but much of it is also going to autocracies. With the changing landscape in the United States, we know that the fossil fuel industries were the one who helped the Trump administration into power. Do we want to further embolden this industry? I guess not, right? So the question is, how do we navigate ourselves out of this dilemma of not being yet fully sustainable, of having also this complicated relationship with China, and being dependent on also their resources for building up our renewable system, while also protecting our industry here. Yeah. So I think this is the issue we have to address jointly.
And now you can hear why we're having this conversation at the German Council on Foreign Relations. Some of the big issues that we've heard about: competitiveness, pocketbook issues, not to name them all of the decisions that need to be made to navigate the immediate near-term future, whether it's energy security, critical minerals and supply chains, stability for the next big shock that might come. These are really the matters of the day. It's not far away. I really took that from what you said, Johan. We are in this new situation now, and all of these important decisions that board members are making, that citizens are making, are really going to lead us into a whole number of different futures. Would like to open to you now as an audience. And I think maybe for the first, I just want to remind you that thanks to our hosts, we have some drinks and refreshments outside. So let's take questions. Clearly, you're going to want to do a lot of conversations, just questions now, and then conversations over a really comfortable, nice kind of drink situation. So I'd also like to balance the room a little bit. And section 2 is leading the race so far. I have 2 questions from this section 3. So we'll start with you. Sorry, I saw your hand first, and we'll go to Farhana and then the back row. And then all of you can think about it.
Thank you. My name is Hartmann Fischer. I'm head of the German policy think tank on climate policy. Mr. Tellinger, our numbers very much agree with what you said, although you say it so much better. The question I have is, if there's such a strong economic argument to transition now in high speed for industry, why is the dominant political medial discourse saying the opposite? You know, the current German government is saying it's too expensive, we have to wait because industry can't do that. I mean, there's vested interests in the fossil fuels and industry and everybody associated with the big central power plants. But that's only, I don't know, 5%, max 10% of the German economy. 80 to 90% should be actually standing on a platform and shouting the same things you are saying, and then we would have a different policy. Why is that not happening?
And before the panelists respond. I'm going to cluster the questions. For Hannah, could we go to you? And then we'll go to the back row. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, all of the panelists. Yeah, I'm Farhana Yamin. This was my 27th COP out of 30. And I think we've made enormous progress, actually. And I think some of the things that are asked of the COP are completely unreasonable and unlawful. So the COP has no legal authority to impose transition plans, for example. Only a handful of countries that submitted their national plans included any kind of language on phase out. Germany has a transition plan, but it's pretty recent, right? And you couldn't persuade the rest of the EU to have a transition away from fossil fuel plans. So just a little grounding on legally what is important right now. And I think, Johan in particular, I would love it if you had a graph that showed the impact of the financial industry on the tipping of boundaries. You did one of the food system, but really the reason why we are so out of kilter and the system of exploitation, appropriation, the economic inequalities, the rise of billionaires, and the concomitant imbalances in our political system is actually to do with the financial sector being completely out of control. It is completely out of control, and no one can reform or govern it. And Paris was supposed to also help nudge the financial system in the right direction. But I think it is completely out of control. We don't have a system of laws and international legal agreements that would regulate that, because again, the powerful countries and the dollar economy and the powerful, richer countries in the EU are also dragging their feet and still allowing the financial sector to invest in whatever it likes, And this is the reason why you're not getting the signals, in my view. But I would love to know if you could produce that graphic of what the dirty finance industry is doing to the tipping boundaries, and not just focus on the real sectors like, industry, transport, food, where real people work, and also show the number of people in the finance industry whose jobs are involved, because that is what is driving, in my view, a great deal of the inertia in the system right now. That is why we can't change.
Okay. And in the back row and the other sections, we're coming to you.
Hi, Thomas Poggi from Yale University. So my question goes in the same direction, really. You started, Professor Rockström, with this tension, which you said is at its peak between, on the one hand, well-evidenced problem statement and well-evidenced solutions, and on the other hand, a lack of political will. So it seems to me that cries out for explanation. And here, three strategies offer themselves, right? One is to say there is irrationality. People are just irrational. A second would be people have a very high time discount function. The money to do something about climate has to be spent now, and the problems occur later, and that's a different generation, or it's a different person, myself, 20 years down the road. And the third, which seems to me to be the most plausible, is that different people are differentially affected. And so those people whose political will really counts are people who are pretty much invulnerable to climate change, can make themselves invulnerable. And then there are also a bunch of people who have a vested interest in the fossil fuels that are still in the ground. So we have owners of fossil fuels, shareholders in oil and gas and coal companies and so on and so forth. And of course, they own collectively something like $500 trillion worth of fossil fuel reserves. So they have a very much a vested interest. And I think that's the key explanation for why we have these heavy fossil fuel subsidies still, which are completely mad, of course, from a collective point of view. Anyway, if you can comment a little bit on what is your sort of scientific, if you like, explanation of why we have this incredible disconnect.
Yeah, thanks. And I see One question over here. Thank you, Group 3. You're doing a good job representing your group. Would you introduce yourself and ask your question, and then we'll come over to the panel.
Yes, thank you for the interesting discussion. My name is Cecilia Kiliman from the Potsdam Institute for Climate Impact Research. Kira, you mentioned the importance of reducing our dependency on fossil fuel imports, also in order to reduce our dependency on autocracies. How do we avoid repeating the same mistakes in a way when it comes to the import of rare minerals and green hydrogen, for example?
Yeah, you mean me, right? Yeah, I'm happy to kick us off with the direct response to this very valid question. I call it like how to avoid the green resource curse, right? So how can we avoid doing the same mistakes, as you put it? I think we are already obviously in a high dependency when it comes to critical raw materials. Here we are highly dependent on China, which has restricted some of the exports of critical raw materials. And there also is dependency on components as well as the different relationships to countries where China is now very present. So a few years ago, I was in the DRC Congo, which produces much of the world's cobalt. And this is mostly in Chinese hands. So the mines in Congo are mostly in Chinese hands. And it speaks volumes to, I think, our lack of strategizing around this issue of planning for a more renewable future, that we have not been able to also invest more in the relationships with countries that will export these types of critical raw materials. And I think we need to heavily engage in this in these markets in order to avoid a similar type of dependency. However, and it's not only for green technologies, obviously, it's also for other technological sectors, which may be even more critical because the resource flows, obviously, into the renewable energy once the system is built up are not as intense and replaceable as in fossil fuels, where you need a constant replacement of your imports, obviously.
Yeah, for sure. I would say the key point is, of course, vested interest, and actually very, very powerful vested interest. Lots of money behind this, quite clearly. And let's say the direct connection to political decision makers, obviously. And this direct connection is actually supported by all kind of, let's say, content production. We know this, and now we could go into, let's say, many topics. One of them is, of course, let's say, what are certain neoliberal think tanks doing? But I'm not going now into this. This is simply the content cloud that is provided to political decision makers, and that content cloud is very, very big compared to, let's say, the content that others are providing. And this is something we actually need to deal with. Absolutely, we need to deal with. If I may, also on the financial industry, now I'm one of the representatives of the 30 industry, quite obviously. My colleagues and I, we are managing an $800 billion fund. That's what I'm actually doing, let's say, as a day job. And therefore, yes, perhaps we are the dirty part. The graph, I would assume, is not too difficult one. Why is that? Because the financial industry is, of course, behind the economic activity all over. This is just how it is. The financial industry is a derivative of the real world economy. This is there. I would say there's lots of parts that are very, very valuable. So financing to a certain degree is, but there are lots of things that are not. And that leads a little bit into this discussion. What do we need to do to actually steer these flows? Well, if we do not talk about, let's say, regulation for financial markets, this will be very difficult. A carbon price is a very important element. It's an absolutely important, but I fear carbon price alone will not do it. Not now. Not now. At a later point in time, absolutely. So this should be, please be not misunderstood. Carbon pricing must be introduced. Absolutely. Absolutely. But there's a transition phase, and the transition phase requires something like a border adjustment mechanism and the like, and other regulation. Financial markets must be regulated. This is very important. Reporting, let's say, what form of asset allocation is wanted, what is not wanted, what form of, let's say, financial activity do we actually want to see, and in what form. That is the way to go. It is obvious that the markets, as it is called, alone will not solve the problem. The markets created the problem.
Yeah, thanks. So addressing your reflection there, Thomas, I mean, to start with, my assessment is that it's a mixture of all the three dimensions you were highlighting. I mean, both ignorance or irrationality, the difficulties we have both in the economy but also as human beings to deal with impacts where we commit now, but the full impacts are felt even if it's just decades into the future. Despite caring for our children, we have difficulties in handling those kind of impacts, while we are much better at rising at immediate crisis. And then number three, as has been emphasized here, the whole vested interest factor. I mean, these are three dimensions which I think interact. But let me just share with you that what concerns me more today is actually the, let's say, passive middle ground of decision makers rather than the populist and denialist on the fringes. Because the denialists have been around all the time. The difficulty we have today is that we have vast majorities, I mean, probably over 80% of both citizens and key stakeholders that do not question human-caused climate change. And they are, in general, supportive. Actually, we know that opinion poll after opinion poll across the entire world shows that we have remarkably high support for science, for humans causing climate change, for willingness to solve this problem. I mean, in the levels of 60-70% globally, even higher in Asia. But still, we don't see the uprising or the support in democratic elections, for example, that you would expect. And I think the reason for this is that we're allowing ourselves still to position climate and environment as one political area in a long string of political areas, and you place the ministries of the environment somewhere in a quite insignificant, poorly funded corner somewhere in your cabinet. And it comes across in media and it comes across in politics as if climate concern is an equal factor as concern for education or health or jobs or defense or security or whatever, immigration, whatever area you may, we have many issues we're concerned about, all of us. When we know that the climate crisis is like the mother of crisis, it should be at the UN Security Council, it should be in the Prime Minister's office, it should be the guiding principle, it's the mother of all questions. And we've not succeeded there. But the evidence is increasingly pointing us clearly that that's what has to happen. And that's why, to close this, to say that as a fourth dimension to your point, and this will perhaps surprise you, but I'm stubbornly insisting that I think we in the scientific community are to a significant extent causing the inaction ourselves. How? Well, through this continuous academic uncertainty range that we are stuck in. And you can I say this not least because tomorrow Professor Naomi Oreskes will be receiving the Volvo Environment Prize, and she was the person who wrote the Merchants of Doubt, who proved that the same actors that supported the tobacco industry to instill doubt. It was never about questioning the science. It was only about maintaining uncertainty to give another 25 years of business for the tobacco industry. And it's the same actors that have then been doing exactly the same thing, following the same script to instill uncertainty on climate. And when Bill Gates put out his memo just a week before COP30, where he kind of in Bill Nordhaus spirit continues to kind of question, well, 2.5 degrees Celsius may not be too bad. We can adapt to that, and we're so innovative, and it instills uncertainty. And you may know that we have today ample scientific evidence that the collapse of the AMOC, the overturning of heat in the North Atlantic, is no longer a low likelihood event. Actually, it has a likelihood somewhere between 1 and 10% of occurring within the next 50 years. Well, ask someone like Günther, and he will say, what? 10% for a catastrophic impact? This is a no-go area. Well, that's exactly where we are. If the AMOC shuts down, it will be a complete disaster for the entire world. Complete disaster for the entire world. And the likelihood levels are today somewhere between 1 and 10%, even higher in some scientific publications. Still, if you walk down the streets of Berlin, nobody will know what you're talking about if you would raise this. I mean, even if you ask about what is 1.5 degrees Celsius to you, is it a big or a low number? And people will say, what are you talking about? This is a failure. It's a failure of communication. I think we need a global campaign on catastrophic risk at a level we've never seen before. I think we need to do what we did during the pandemic. In my country, in Sweden, at 2 o'clock in the afternoon, every day for 2 years, the government had a press conference saying, dear Swedish citizens, put on a mask, stay at home, this is dangerous, you have to protect your best loved ones. Every day, 2 o'clock for 2 years. Well, did we understand we had a problem? Oh, yes, we did. Climate change, when do you see this happening? I mean, I think this is the kind of level of leadership that we're lacking. You have a financial crisis, and you'll see the finance ministers in Europe flying down to Brussels a Sunday to solve the problem. When have you ever seen any, even Minister of the Environment, fly anywhere on a Sunday to do anything related to the climate issue? It never occurs. You have this Olympic Games or COP each year, and then they go around 2 weeks to give this therapy of giving an impression that they're solving the problem, and then they go home and then do nothing. So I think we have to simply switch over to a completely different way of communicating risk. Sorry for going on too long on that.
Actually, Kira, I'd like to give you the last word.
It's already time.
But after Günther.
Okay.
And then for all of you, I'm sure you have so much more you want to talk about. Hold on to it in your brains, and we'll go out and enjoy a drink and a few snacks, and we can continue the conversation. Please, for both of you, can bring us home.
Yeah, then very quickly, I very much support what you just said. If I perhaps may try to add a little bit, I do think we have a massive integrity issue, really a massive integrity issue. You can, if you wish, let's say, put out this test, which is if, let's say, somebody has trouble to understand what we just heard out there, and then really ask how can that be ever considered, let's say, by a person who has not an integrity issue? How can that be? And let's say you be given this explanation. Why is it that I can, let's say, not understand what the explanation is in terms of risk and still believe that my behavior is what others would call, let's say, an integrity-like behavior. And that starts then, let's say, to work a little bit, because the moment the people would be willing to accept, we would be talking about risk awareness. We would really be talking what risks we have and how do we deal with it. And this risk awareness would help many, many people to see that they actually need to really deal with the issue that we are producing with this form of economic activity. That is an immediate step. So what risks do I face? And am I willing to really live with these risks? And then many things follow, including, am I happy that my pension fund invests into certain assets?
I want to just build on what Johann mentioned regarding the level of risks that we are currently accepting. Taking this into account, I want to second that we need to bring this also more into the security sphere. And this is exactly why the German National Security Council needs to have climate science inputs. Otherwise, we will fly blindly into the storm.
Really like to thank our panelists. We want to learn so much more from you. Thank you to you as an audience. You've been attentive, thoughtful, and thank you to our host, the German Council on Foreign Relations. We'd like to close this portion of the event and continue this conversation out over drinks and food. Thank you so much, everyone.